Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to lead off with Jim Kelly, who died recently at the age of 67. Jim Kelly was the greatest African-American martial arts master in the movies of the 1970s. He started martial arts training before most people had ever heard of it in the 1960s in Kentucky, did a lot in Chicago here, and then he moved to San Diego. His timing was perfect because martial arts movies were taking off in the early 1970s. He was a very good-looking guy with a big afro in those days, and he got a role in the most famous martial arts movie of all time, 1973's Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. I have to tell you, even if 1970s martial arts movies are your thing, they're not big on dialogue. They're really not known for their great dialogue. But Jim Kelly probably had the greatest dialogue ever in a martial arts movie in Enter the Dragon, which admittedly is a low bar. Here it is right before one of your standard martial arts fights.
We are all ready to win, just as we are born, knowing only life. It is defeat that you must learn to prepare for.
I don't waste my time with it. When it comes, I won't even notice.
Oh, how so?
I'll be too busy looking good.
It is not possible.
Mr. Handman, man, you come right out of a comic book. Been practicing, huh?
He'd be too busy looking good. I have a feeling if Bruce Lee had lived, Jim Kelly would have been an even bigger star. He went on and did a couple more martial arts movies. He did a spaghetti western with Fred Williamson and Jim Brown, which I think was probably pretty interesting. But his problem was, even though he was good looking, and he was a very nice guy by all accounts, every interview I've seen, he seems like a very nice guy. Problem is he wasn't much of an actor, so he didn't have much of a Hollywood career after that. Did a lot of comic book conventions. He was always willing to tell good stories about Bruce Lee. And he had one final scene in the spotlight with a 2011 television commercial that aired only in the Far East with LeBron James.
You think you're super bad? I ain't super bad. You ain't got no game, brother. I ain't got no game,
That was Jim Kelly. Like I said, his timing was good when he fit right into the 1970s martial arts craze, and his luck was bad when his great friend Bruce Lee died. We're going to move on now to Jim Hudson, who died recently at the age of 70. Jim Hudson was a football player. He was a defensive back with the New York Jets, and he probably wouldn't get a mention except that he made one of the most famous plays of all time in one of the most famous games of all time. In Super Bowl III in 1969, where Joe Namath guaranteed victory over the heavily favored Baltimore Colts, everybody laughed because the AFL, this was before the merger between the NFL and the AFL, had lost the first two Super Bowls by wide margins to the Green Bay Packers. The Colts were a powerhouse, but Namath made his guarantee. And the first quarter of the game looked like it would turn out to be a rout, but the Colts were turned back several times. The Jets scored an early touchdown in the second period, and the Colts were driving to tie the score at halftime when they called a flea flicker at midfield. Quarterback Earl Morrall handed the ball off to Tom Matte, and the halfback passed back to Morrall. Morrall had a wide-open receiver in the end zone. All he had to do was throw it to him. It was Jimmy Orr, but he missed seeing him, and he threw short, and Jim Hudson intercepted the ball, and that was basically the turning point of the game. The Jets went on to win the game in the biggest upset in Super Bowl history, and that game forced the merger of the two leagues. Here's the story of Super Bowl III with an emphasis on the halftime interception by Jim Hudson. It starts out with Broadway Joe.
You have anything to prove in this game?
They were the best team in the world. The NFL had been looking down on the AFL for a long time. The league was only, at that time, 8, 9 years old. They weren't treated nicely by the other league. So there was a lot of pride involved. And it was, like when you're a little boy, your guys are playing the other guys and you don't like them because they've been nasty to you. So it was important in that respect.
I'd been doing the early days of the AFL. They were laughed at and
ridiculed and scoffed at. I could see the league getting better every year. They had exciting players in it. And up they come to play the Colts, who had won 15 and lost 1 that year, and beat the Browns 34-0 in the NFL championship game. I think the game opened at 18 points. Colts favored at 19. About game time, it was 20-21 points. When I said, I guarantee you we're going to win the game, I was at the Miami Touchdown Club a few days before. I didn't have a prepared speech. Someone made a noise in the back or whatever. It sounded like a Baltimore guy, in fact it was. And I asked him to sit down and shut up, and went into, you guys are mighty confident. You think you're going to win this game, making 17, 19-point underdogs of us. Well, that's ridiculous. We have a better team. In fact, we're going to win the game, I guarantee you. I was angry.
I liked the 17-point underdog when we went down there. And as a matter of fact, I told all the fellas, don't pay any attention to what I say in the news group, because I'm going to try to make it 21 points if I can. And that Joe, he went out there to the banquet, somebody asked him who's going to win, and he says, the Jets are, and I guarantee. Well, I could have shot him.
Joe had the confidence, and of course he was brash enough to come out and say it. We tried to use it so that would help get our football team up, and our players talked about, hey, that quarterback's bragging about how they're going to beat us, let's get ourselves ready to go. But as it turned out, he was a prophet.
I loved the opportunity to go after these guys. They had a defense that was excellent, but I knew we could beat it. It was a tremendous challenge. It was as serious as it could possibly get, except for being killed or having to kill someone. I mean, it was a kill-or-be-killed situation as a football player, and everyone on our team felt that way, and that's why we outperformed them.
With 25 seconds left in the half, the Colts again penetrated Jet territory. This time, Morrill called for a bit of razzle-dazzle that he had used successfully earlier in the season. 4 months before against the Atlanta Falcons, the play resulted in a touchdown pass from Morrill to flanker Jimmy Orr. Against the Jets, it began successfully, but Morrill's pass to fullback Jerry Hill fell short and was intercepted by Jim Hudson. The real tragedy of the play, however, was the fact that Jimmy Orr, the primary receiver, was standing all alone within easy reach of the end zone. Morrill did not see him and threw instead down the middle, where Hudson intercepted.
John Matty to throw a pass back to Morrill. All alone is Jimmy Orr, but they hit down the middle, and Matty intercepted by Jim Hudson. The third interception for New York. The third interception for New York. And Baltimore trying a trick play. They had Jimmy Orr all alone, and they didn't see him.
We went into halftime with old Mo on our side, momentum. We had a wonderful drive, made it 7-0. They came back. Orr thought he was open in the end zone. Why, to this day, Jimmy thought he was open. He was waving to somebody up in the stands. He knew Earl wouldn't see him.
We didn't get the job done in the first half. We had a lot of opportunities, and it wasn't Earl's fault that we didn't get the job done. True, Earl didn't see Jimmy Orr when he was wide open waving in the end zone. He missed that because the band was in the end zone waiting to come out at halftime.
Well, as I said, that was the game that changed the course of professional football because it sort of forced the merger between the two leagues, and Jim Hudson was a sort of a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern player in that. The ironic thing is, 5 years before that, Joe Namath and Jim Hudson had crossed paths in another role, and there was a third protagonist to the story who also died recently and also played in Super Bowl III. Joe Namath was the quarterback of the Bear Bryant, Alabama team that had been the national champions in 1963. On New Year's Day in 1965, Namath was playing in his last game in the Orange Bowl against the University of Texas. Hudson was a defensive back for the University of Texas, but moved in to play quarterback when the starting quarterback wasn't doing well. Texas beat Namath that night largely on the strength of a touchdown pass that Hudson threw to a receiver named George Sauer. Namath became the big bonus baby drafted by the Jets as their star quarterback and went on to an illustrious career. Hudson was an undrafted free agent who became their defensive back and made that great play. And George Sauer became a receiver for the Jets and caught 8 passes in that Super Bowl. Sauer was a 4-time All-Star in the AFL, and he became one of Namath's favorite receivers. George Sauer died recently at the age of 70 also, so I guess we can put him together with Jim Hudson and say goodbye to these two great Jets who teamed up to beat Joe Namath in the 1965 Orange Bowl and then became stars with him in Super Bowl III, one of the most famous games in history. We're going to close tonight with Doug Engelbart, who died recently at the age of 88. and Doug Engelbart was one of the pioneers of the internet, one of the most important people in our current age of computers. In the mid-1960s, Doug Engelbart invented the computer mouse, but he actually did much more than that. When he came back from World War II, where he served briefly, he read an article by Vannevar Bush, who was one of the president's main scientific advisors on collective intelligence, and he worked with collective intelligence and computers the rest of his life. He got a PhD from Berkeley, and then he helped develop the Stanford Research Institute. And the scientists at the Stanford Research Institute, working with the Defense Department, were the people who basically came up with the internet. Here's an NPR report on the career of Douglas Engelbart.
The computer visionary best known for inventing the mouse has died. As NPR's Laura Seidel reports, the mouse was just one small piece of what Douglas Engelbart contributed to the development of personal computers.
One astute Silicon Valley observer remarked that saying Doug Engelbart invented the mouse is a little like saying that Henry Ford invented the steering wheel. Engelbart first showed it off along with many other inventions at a conference in San Francisco for computer professionals in 1968. Most of them were interacting with computers as big as a football field with punch cards. An amazed audience looked on as Engelbart sat in front of a computer screen with a keyboard and a mouse.
We start by building an instrument that we can sit at and work during our day to organize the kind of working information we need as a task force developing systems.
Engelbart actually made a joke about the mouse.
I don't know why we call it a mouse. Sometimes I apologize. It started that way, and we never did change it.
Obviously, the name stuck. Engelbart also showed how computers could connect over a network and how two people on different computers could work on a document at the same time. And
come in, Menlo Park.
Engelbart held the first ever video conference in front of the audience.
Okay, there's Don Andrews' hand in Menlo Park.
Engelbart and his team at the Stanford Research Institute introduced so many new inventions and ideas that day that computer professionals dubbed it the mother of all demos. Many of his inventions would go on to become crucial to the personal computer revolution, though Engelbart almost never profited. For example, by the time the mouse was made popular by Steve Jobs and Apple Computer in the 1980s, the patent on it had run out. Though much of Engelbart's work helped make computers easier to use, that wasn't his goal.
In fact, he was mildly appalled by the Macintosh.
Paul Sappho, who teaches at Stanford, was a friend of Engelbart's. He says Engelbart was thinking in bigger terms.
Doug's vision was to create a new home for the human mind, to turn digital technology into powerful tools that would help us meet the ever greater challenges on this planet.
The Computer History Museum, where Engelbart was a fellow, said he was notified of his death by his daughter, who said he died in his sleep. He was 88 years old. Laura Seidel, NPR News, San Francisco.
Here's a little bit more from that mother of all demos in 1968, where Engelbart talks about the development of the mouse. Mother of all demos. One thing I've noticed about these computer guys, they may be brilliant, but with the exception of Steve Wozniak, most of them are not known for their modesty.
The products of this program, technology of it, lends itself well to an interesting way to portray it for you. So we're going to try our best to show you rather than tell you about this program. Okay, there's Don Andrews' hand in Menlo Park. And in a second, we'll see the screen that he's working and the way the tracking spot moves in conjunction with movements of that mouse. I don't know why we call it a mouse. Sometimes I apologize. It started that way, and we never did change it. All right, as it moves up or down or sideways, so does the tracking spot. And the principles for its operation are quite easy to see. If you'll turn it over, Don. Its principle is that there are two wheels that roll on the surface. But since they're at right angles and kind of sharp edges, one roll and the other slide in one direction. And as the mouse moves over a surface, then each of those wheels either slides sideways without rolling or rolls an amount that very closely duplicates the particular component of horizontal or vertical in the net motion it makes.
I was sitting in a conference probably about 1961, and it was a conference on computer graphics, primitive as it was then. And I think I got bored at the kind of way they were dealing with it because, it was going to get interactive and they should realize that more. I realized that, pointing at the screen was always going to be important. And, it just suddenly occurred to me, why don't I put wheels in two directions and get them on a device like this and move it around, and each wheel gets registered in the computer as how far you move up and down or how far you move sideways. That would be great.
If you take a mouse and move it through some closed trajectory back to exactly the same point, usually the tracking spot won't come back to exactly the same place it was on the screen. And for that sense, it wouldn't work well if you're trying to trace maps or other figures and diagrams. But the way we use it continuously and exclusively is to watch the screen and to follow it around. And we use this merely as a device to move that tracking spot. And your eye on the tracking spot, you really don't care whether it follows exactly this or not.
Even though people like my producer Sid Tepps, who know a lot more about it than me, say we may not be using it much longer, the mouse is clearly a brilliant invention. Here's Engelbart later in life talking about how it got its name.
Somebody noticed it sitting there, I think, with a little ear and a tail coming out the side, and called it a mouse. But I wasn't the kind of person that made up the names for what we're going to call it, just a gadget. And nobody can remember among all the people who were involved in that who first started calling it a mouse. But that name just stuck. And we all assumed later it was going to win when the world got interested in working computer interactions, that would be a good contender. But of course it would have a sort of an official, dignified name when it got out to the world. But it was almost 20 years later before, that was 1963. And it was quite a few years before the world wanted to start using it.
And in terms of royalties, the story coming out is that he didn't get any royalties because the mouse didn't really sell until its patent was up at 17 years in the early 1980s, and Apple had just started using it. But in reality, the story is a little different. He never really owned the patent to the mouse.
Do you own the patent on this thing?
Well, no, the patent is who the patent was made out to and who it's signed over to are two different things. So I was the inventor, but I was working for Stanford Research Institute, so you have to sign over everything.
So every time someone buys a mouse, you don't get anything?
I would like to have gotten the money from it, but it wasn't what I was after, and I knew it. So
You had a different reason for it.
Yeah.
You were trying to fulfill a need.
And that's been driving me ever since, very, very, very hard. That very much convinced that there are places we can get to that we can have a much smarter society. It's kind of trying to awake people to the potential, of which this is just scratching the surface of what's really there to help people think and work together.
Here's William Dutton, professor of Internet Studies at Oxford, who knew Doug Engelbart.
The mouse was invented in about 1967, but early in the 60s, he had a vision of networking the world, of actually creating an online system that would support collaboration and communication among people remotely located. He always had a vision inspired by Vannevar Bush, and which inspired Ted Nelson and others, of a networked hypertext global information system. But he called his system the online system, or NLS, and this was a vision he had in 1962, which is essentially what we have today. And of course, now people have in their hands the ability to connect with millions and millions of computers worldwide. And what we have today was the vision of Doug Engelbart and his colleagues. He has never been satisfied. You would think that he would say, oh my goodness, we have realized my vision. But no, he was always thinking that it could actually be better, that it falls short of what we actually could achieve.
Douglas Engelbart, one of the first people to realize the full measure of what computers would mean to society decades before they became a reality. Well, I think I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. We needed a mouse song tonight as a final tribute to Doug Engelbart. So I went to Mr. Milton Soupman, who did the greatest mouse song ever recorded. What's that, you say? You've never heard of Milton Soupman? Well, probably you know him by his other name, Soupy Sales. And here he is with that 1965 classic, Do the Mouse.
We're going to do the old mouse, so everybody do.